Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you how I built this wedding arbor out of some rough sawn hemlock. It comes apart and actually packs pretty flat. I think it came out great. Check it out. So I'm going to be using some rough sawn hemlock on this project, but you could definitely do this with just regular store-bought 2x materials. So 2x8s, 2x4s, and some 1x6. Now, I got this material from a local sawmill, and it was much less expensive than domestic lumber, but obviously I had to go through the process of milling it down. Now, I have a big planer and a joiner, but you don't really need these things if you wanted to build something like this. And the plans that I'll attach to this, sort of the sketch, we'll sort of skip all this if you wanted to use 2x material. Now I'm ripping these down to 4 inches wide, and these are actually truly 2 inches thick. So they are a little bit thicker than the normal kind of 1.5 thickness material that you buy from the store, but it's all the same. Now I'm going to be cutting this down on the miter saw and getting my dimensions together for my uprights and my horizontal pieces for the ground. Now, in order to get my uprights installed into the support pieces on the floor, I want to do a rabbet cut and cut out some material so that they can pocket in really well and get a nice positive sort of registration, and I'll use glue. Now, this is a really easy thing to do if you have a sliding miter saw. You can take your miter saw and you can set the depth of the cut. Now, almost every sliding saw I've ever used has had this, and the only thing you need to do is put a sacrificial block behind your material. Now you can see here by making many cuts and sliding the saw back and forth, I'm basically doing what you could do with a router, but in a much more controlled fashion. And since I marked out the space beforehand with a sample piece of material, I'm able to get a really tight fit, and I'm able to do this on both pieces very, very easily. And this is going to allow me just a stronger joint where my vertical meets my horizontal and my ground support. So with those rabbets cut in these horizontal supports, I can just use a chisel to clean them up a little bit before I go ahead and glue and screw in the vertical posts. Now, you get pretty close with the miter saw, but a little bit of chisel work just makes the fit up that much better. And it's a little hard to get a perfectly flat bottom with the miter saw, so super easy here, just cleaning this up. And the hemlock that I'm using is pretty soft. It's about the same consistency as, some kiln dried material that you would get from like Home Depot or Lowe's. So a little bit of Type-On 3 because this is going to be outside and I want a little bit longer working time, and then I just nail it in with a mallet. Now I'm using 3-inch epoxy coated decking screws for this, and I'm going to countersink and put these in straight through the bottom and then kind of toe screw them so that I get a little bit more grab. I'm going to be adding some 45-degree bracing as well, which is going to help with stability. And you can see right there I had to do a little additional chiseling to make sure that this piece fit in. I want a nice tight fit on this, which will just sort of help keep things from rocking. Now this thing's never really going to be under any force because it's just an arbor, right? It's going to stand up at the altar at the venue where I'm getting married. So it's not really going to have a lot of load on it, but obviously I don't want it falling down. That'd be pretty embarrassing. Now I'm making the 45-degree braces. And again, I'm just cutting everything on the miter saw and cutting these down vertically so that I can get a nice grab, a nice 45-degree support piece that will keep this thing from rocking. Now I'm using one of these 90-degree squares that I use on my welding table, but you could really use anything to brace this. Now the fastening method that I'm using for this entire thing is I'm going to be countersinking and then drilling and plugging all the holes. I'm using a flip over countersinking bit from Montana Drills. And basically what it does is it countersinks, and then you can go just a little bit deeper and leave room for a wooden peg. And then they sell a plug cutting kit, which can hook up right to your drill. And you can make plugs out of the same material, and then using some glue and a mallet, you can fill the holes so that it basically doesn't even look like you have a screw there. It's really nice for this type of application where you're trying to work relatively quickly, but you want a really clean look. I didn't want anyone to ever see that I used screws on this. You want this thing to look like it's kind of mortise and tenon. Now to work on the header piece, this is just a 1x6 of the same material. And I'm just laying out where some blocking is going to go. And I'm going to be cutting sort of a rake angle on the end to give it a little bit of character. And I'm going to be cutting down my verticals so that I can understand the full scale of the piece. Now I'm kind of building this off of a drawing that I made, but at the same time, I want to make sure that it looks correctly in sort of human scale. So I sort of freewheeled the length of those posts, and I left them long, and I also left the horizontals long as I was building it so that I could go back, cut them later, and make sure everything looked proportional. When you're building something that's so large and you're going to have people standing underneath it, drawing it on the computer can sort of dilute the scale. So you want to make sure that you understand how big it's going to be in real life before you make any final decisions. And you can see here I am cutting that sort of rake angle on the header piece. Now there's going to be 2 of these, so I cut one and then I trace it onto the other board and cut that one as well. One of the boards I had was slightly shorter than the other, so I had to obviously use the shorter board as my template and then cut the longer board down to match. Now as I'm going, I'm sort of doing a little bit of sanding. And since everything was planed, it's pretty smooth, but I want to make sure it looks really good and accepts the stain well. And now I'm just laying out for some blocking. So now the whole point of this thing is that it needs to be able to be taken down. And if you're building one of these, either for yourself or maybe you do event rental, I know a lot of event rental people reach out to me here on YouTube and ask me to build stuff for them. But you know, having something that's just so cumbersome like an arbor, you need to be able to take it apart and move it, even if this is for your own wedding. I have a big truck. I've got a Sprinter van, and I couldn't even fit this in there assembled. So being able to take it apart is really important. So I put this blocking inside of it and glued it together and made the head an independent piece. When this thing is done, it'll be 3 independent pieces that could really be easily moved by one person, and then just bolted together with a couple of carriage bolts, and you could reassemble this alone and stand it up. Right after our wedding, actually some friends of ours got married and we lent them this thing, and it was really easy for them to just sort of take it and use it and give it back. So now with the headpiece glued and I let it dry, I can assemble it onto the top, and I'm going to do just a little bit of sanding on those verticals so that things fit with sort of a slip fit. I don't want it to be too tight. And then I'm going to lay everything out here and start drilling my holes for my carriage bolts and also adding some 45-degree braces. Now these braces are going to help with rocking and also just add a little bit of a nice decorative piece, and they're only going to get fastened to the vertical member. They're not going to get fastened to the head permanently, but they are going to get a carriage bolt through them. Now here I'm using longer decking screws, but again, they're all going to get plugged, so you're not going to see any of where the screws are, and a little bit of glue goes a long way with the screws and makes everything super tight. It's going to definitely hold on for the long run. Now I'm going to be using 1/2-inch carriage bolts for this, and the reason I'm using carriage bolts is because they have that flat head on them, and you won't really even notice them when this thing is done. I use a 1/2-inch brad point drill bit, also from Montana, and I make sure to kind of wiggle the bit around in the hole because I do want a little bit of a slip fit. I don't need a super tight fit here because I do need to get these bolts in and out. Now carriage bolts need to be sunk into the mating material because they have that square kind of shoulder on them. So I drill through in the 3 spots, and you can see how this is going to hold this thing together really well. I stand it up off of my table and get a look of its proportions, and overall super happy with the way that it looks. And now with all of that done, I can knock the bolts back out and start taking things apart so that I can begin the finishing and staining process. Now, like I said, this was rough sawn hemlock when I got it, and it was honestly a little bit wet. So as I was working on it, it was sort of drying. And ideally, you want to use something really dry because just for glue's sake and for finishing sake. Now, before I start the finishing process, you can see me using this sort of like big drill bit. Well, basically, that's a plug cutter, and it hooks right up to your drill, and it makes a little male plug that fits inside the female hole that you drilled with your countersink. So you can see me just gluing and nailing these little pegs in, and then just going back to my board and popping out little pins, nailing them in and gluing them in. And then once the glue's dry, I sand over them, and these screw holes completely disappear. It's a really nice way to make a high finish piece without actually having to do a lot of forethought and joinery. Now, obviously, before I go ahead and finish this, I've got to do a lot of sanding. You know, I just went through this thing pretty quickly with 180 grit and made sure that I got all the surfaces so that there wasn't any glue drip out or anything like that. And then I went through with a special walnut stain, and stain this thing up. Now, this wood took a lot of stain. It was super porous, so I had to layer it on and really make sure that I had even coverage. On a piece this large, it can be a little bit daunting to stain it because unlike paint, you really want to make sure you don't have any drips that overlap because you'll cause darkening. So you want to make sure that you spread everything out, and if you overdo it in some spots, you want to make sure you kind of thin it down. Now, once that was dry, I could bring it out to the venue, and here I am the day before my wedding setting up something that I built. We built a lot of stuff for our wedding, and this was one of the kind of main pieces. None of our vendors had anything like it, so we found a design online, my wife and I designed it and built it. And there's my friend Kerry helping me put it up. Now you can see I'm able to assemble it on the ground, and she helped me stand it up, but really you could do it alone. I knock in the carriage bolts and then put in the wing nuts on the back side. You might be able to tell, but I painted the carriage bolts black so they wouldn't really be noticed. And then the only other thing I did was I added some L-shaped tent stakes to the bottom so that just in case we got a little bit of wind, it wouldn't move. Now, my florist completely covered this thing in flowers, and it looked so beautiful the day of our wedding. We were so happy with how it came out. They did an amazing job doing our whole wedding, but especially just decorating the arbor. And while it did hide a lot of the woodwork, I thought it looked really beautiful, and our guests really loved it. So I think it came out great. All right, that about does it for this video. Again, this thing was a pretty simple project. You didn't have to use the rough saw material like I used. You really could just use dimensional 2x material and 1x material for the head. I happened to get this hemlock for a really good price during the kind of uprise of domestic lumber, and I think the way it stained up looked really good. The plug cutter kit I used from Montana Tools works awesome for projects like this, and you really can't even tell that I used screws and no real like dowel fasteners on this. If you want some links to the dimensions I used on this, I'll put them down below. This was actually for my wedding, and I think it came out awesome. Hopefully it looks good in the photos that I showed before I said this, which would be after I filmed this. Yeah, that's right. Check me out on Instagram right here at Make Everything Shop. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos in the shop and more videos like this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one. Cut. That's it.